Karen HOA President loses control when I, a veteran, refuse to let her inspect my private property. What started as a simple property dispute quickly spiraled into a battle of wills that would expose corruption, test my military training, and remind me that sometimes the toughest fights happen right in your own backyard. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. After serving 15 years in the Marine Corps, including 3 tours in Afghanistan, I thought I'd seen it all. The constant explosions, the desert heat, and the weight of command had prepared me for almost anything. But nothing in my military career could have prepared me for the suburban warfare that erupted when I bought my dream home in Pine Grove Estates. I'd chosen this neighborhood carefully. The quiet streets lined with mature oak trees, well-maintained homes, and friendly neighbors seemed perfect for someone like me who needed peace and stability after years of service. The property itself was everything I'd dreamed of while deployed, a modest 2-story colonial with a spacious backyard where I could finally start that vegetable garden I'd been planning. The previous owner, an elderly widow, had let things slip a bit, but I saw potential in every overgrown flower bed and weathered fence post. The realtor had mentioned there was an HOA, but assured me it was mostly hands-off, focusing on maintaining property values and organizing the occasional community event. What she failed to mention was Margaret Thompson, the HOA president who ran the neighborhood like her personal fiefdom. I'd later learn that Margaret, or Marge, as she insisted on being called, had turned what should have been a simple community organization into her own private enforcement agency. My first few weeks were peaceful enough. I spent my days working from home as a cybersecurity consultant, a skill I'd picked up during my final years in the Corps, and my evenings slowly bringing the property back to life. The work was therapeutic, helping ease the transition from military to civilian life. My service-connected disability meant I had to take frequent breaks, but there was something satisfying about watching the property transform under my care. Then came that fateful Sunday morning. I was in my backyard, carefully planning out the raised garden beds that would help accommodate my mobility issues, when I heard the distinctive click-clack of heels on concrete. Looking up, I saw a woman in her mid-50s, dressed like she was heading to a corporate board meeting rather than taking a weekend stroll. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and permanent smile reminded me of those recruitment officers who'd visit the base, all polish and procedure until something didn't go their way. "Good morning," she called out, her voice carrying that artificial sweetness that immediately set off my tactical awareness. "I'm Margaret Thompson, HOA President. I noticed you've been making some changes to the property, and I'm here for the mandatory inspection." That moment, standing there with my garden plans in hand, I had no idea I was about to enter a conflict that would rival some of my most challenging military operations. But something in her tone, that assumption of authority over my private property, triggered the same instincts that had kept me alive in combat. This wasn't just about garden beds and fences anymore. This was about standing your ground when someone tries to take what's rightfully yours. Little did I know that my refusal to let her onto my property that morning would unleash a chain of events that would expose years of neighborhood manipulation, challenge my PTSD recovery, and ultimately force me to use every bit of strategic training I'd acquired in the Marines. But unlike my military service, this time the battlefield was my own backyard, and my opponent wasn't a foreign adversary. It was a Karen with a clipboard and a God complex. This is the story of how one HOA president's power trip collided head-on with a Marine who'd sworn an oath to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic, even if they came wearing designer suits and carrying violation notices. The transition to civilian life had been a journey in itself. After being medically discharged due to injuries sustained from an IED blast, I'd spent months in physical therapy, learning to navigate life with chronic pain and a titanium rod in my left leg. The doctors had recommended a quiet environment for managing my PTSD, somewhere stable where I could establish routines and rebuild my life. Pine Grove Estates, with its tree-lined streets and peaceful atmosphere, seemed like the perfect choice. I'd done my homework before buying the property. The neighborhood sat on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina, far enough from the city to avoid the worst of the traffic, but close enough to access the VA hospital when needed. The previous owner, Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, had lived there for 30 years before moving to assisted living. Her son had told me stories about how the community used to be, neighbors helping neighbors, kids playing in the streets, and a genuine sense of belonging. That sense of community was what drew me in. After years of living on bases around the world, always part of a tight-knit unit, I craved that same connection. The few neighbors I'd met seemed friendly enough. There was Tom, a retired high school teacher next door, who shared my interest in gardening. Sarah, a young mom across the street, whose kids would wave enthusiastically whenever I checked my mail. Even Mr. Chen, the quiet accountant 2 houses down, would nod respectfully during his morning walks. But there was something else I'd noticed during my first few weeks. A tension that seemed to ripple through the neighborhood whenever certain topics came up. Conversations would stop abruptly when the HOA was mentioned. People would glance over their shoulders before sharing whispered complaints about property restrictions. It was subtle, but as someone trained to read environments and assess threats, I couldn't ignore the signs. I'd started renovating almost immediately after moving in. The property needed work, but I saw it as part of my therapy. My occupational therapist had encouraged finding projects that would keep both my body and mind active. The backyard became my primary focus. I planned to transform it into a sustainable garden that would accommodate my physical limitations while providing fresh vegetables and herbs. The raised beds would mean less bending, and the wide paths between them would allow easy access even on my bad days. The front yard needed attention, too. The grass had grown wild, and the flower beds were overrun with weeds. I'd spent my first weekend clearing out the dead plants and mapping out a new landscape design. Several neighbors had stopped by to introduce themselves, offering advice and encouragement. Mr. Chen even brought over some potted orchids, explaining that they were hardy enough to survive a beginner's mistakes. But not everyone seemed pleased with my improvements. I'd caught glimpses of Margaret Thompson watching from her SUV as she drove past my house, her expression growing more disapproving with each passing day. The neighbors had started dropping hints about her, how she'd taken control of the HOA, bought 5 years ago, and gradually transformed it from a community organization into her personal kingdom. "Just be careful," Tom had warned one evening, leaning over the fence as I worked in the yard. "Marge has her own vision for this neighborhood, and she doesn't take kindly to people who don't fall in line. Last summer, she forced the Wilsons to tear out their entire garden because she decided vegetable plants were unsightly." I'd listened to these warnings, but hadn't given them too much weight. After all, I'd faced down insurgents and survived. Roadside bombs. How bad could one overzealous HOA president be? Besides, I'd specifically checked the property's status before purchasing. While the house was within HOA boundaries, the previous owner had opted out years ago when the association first formed. The property was grandfathered in, meaning I had no obligation to follow their rules. Looking back, I should have recognized the warning signs. The way other residents would hurry inside when Margaret's black Range Rover cruised by. The perfectly manicured lawns that all seemed to follow the same rigid pattern. The identical beige paint on every house except mine. These weren't just coincidences, they were symptoms of a deeper problem, one that I was about to face head-on. As I stood in my backyard that Sunday morning watching Margaret's approach, I couldn't help but think about the irony. I'd survived multiple combat deployments only to find myself preparing for battle in suburban America. But this time, I had something worth fighting for. Not just my property rights, but the very peace and independence I'd sacrificed so much to protect. Margaret Thompson's reputation had preceded her long before our first encounter. During my initial weeks in Pine Grove Estates, fragments of stories about her would surface in conversations with neighbors, each one painting a clearer picture of the woman who'd appointed herself guardian of suburban perfection. She'd moved into the neighborhood 7 years ago, fresh from a corporate downsizing that had ended her career as a regional manager for a major retail chain. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, or perhaps orchestrated, as some neighbors suggested. The previous HOA president had just announced his retirement, and Margaret had smoothly stepped into the role, promising to maintain property values and enhance community standards. What started as simple suggestions for improvement quickly evolved into rigid mandates. Under Margaret's leadership, the HOA handbook grew from a modest 20-page document to a 156-page manifesto detailing everything from acceptable mailbox colors to the maximum allowable height of garden gnomes. She'd instituted monthly property inspections, quarterly compliance reviews, and what she called community enhancement citations, which most residents simply called harassment notices. Sarah, the young mum across the street, had filled me in on some of the more notorious incidents during one of our over-the-fence chats. 2 years ago, the Petersons wanted to paint their house light blue, a perfectly nice color that matched several other homes in the area. Margaret rejected their application 3 times, claiming it wasn't the right shade of blue. They ended up painting it the same beige as everyone else, just to avoid the daily fines. Then there was the story of Mr. Rodriguez, a retired teacher who'd installed a small fountain in his front yard as a memorial to his late wife. Margaret had deemed it an unauthorized water feature and threatened legal action unless it was removed. He'd taken it down the next day. His daughter later told me he couldn't bear the stress of fighting it. The most revealing story came from Tom, who'd lived in Pine Grove Estates longer than anyone else. He remembered when Margaret first joined the HOA board, presenting herself as a voice of reason and progress. She was clever about it, he explained one evening, lowering his voice despite being in his own backyard. Started small, building support among the newer residents who were worried about property values. Before anyone realized what was happening, she'd replaced most of the board members with her own supporters. These stories had seemed almost comical at first, the kind of suburban drama you'd see in a sitcom. But there was something darker beneath the surface. Margaret wasn't just a busybody with too much time on her hands. She was someone who'd lost power in her professional life and was determined to reclaim it through other means. The neighbors, who'd been here longest, spoke of how the community had changed. Block parties and neighborhood cookouts had given way to formal HOA meetings and property inspections. The children's playground had been removed because it created potential liability issues. Even the annual Christmas decoration contest had been replaced with strict guidelines about acceptable holiday displays. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What struck me most was how Margaret had managed to maintain her position despite widespread discontent. Some suggested it was simple apathy. Most residents were too busy with their own lives to challenge her authority. Others hinted at more strategic methods. Selective enforcement of rules, implied threats about property values, and careful cultivation of allies on the HOA board. Mr. Chen had perhaps summed it up best during one of his morning walks. "In my country, we had a saying about people like her. The most dangerous kind of power is the kind that convinces others they are powerless. As a veteran, those words resonated with me. I'd seen similar tactics used in other contexts, where control was maintained not through direct force, but through the careful manipulation of fear and uncertainty. The more I learned about Margaret Thompson, the more I understood that my conflict with her was inevitable. Not just because of my status as a non-HOA member, but because I represented something she couldn't control, a challenge to her carefully constructed authority. My property improvements, while modest, were being done without her approval or oversight. My very presence was a crack in the facade of her perfect, regulated world. Some neighbors had already started taking notice. They'd watch from behind curtained windows as I worked in my yard, making changes that would have required multiple approvals and forms under Margaret's regime. A few had even started to ask quiet questions about how I'd managed to avoid HOA oversight, though they'd quickly change the subject if anyone else approached. And as I would soon discover, Margaret Thompson wasn't just a neighborhood nuisance. She was a symptom of what happens when power goes unchecked, when rules become weapons, and when community gives way to control. My military training had taught me to recognize threats, assess situations, and stand my ground when necessary. Little did I know how valuable those skills would prove in the suburban battlefield of Pine Grove Estates. My days fell into a comfortable routine during those first few weeks. Every morning, I'd wake up before sunrise, old military habits die hard, and start with a modified PT routine that my physical therapist had designed. The exercises helped manage the stiffness in my leg and kept the worst of the pain at bay. Then after a protein shake and coffee on the back porch, I'd settle into my home office for my cybersecurity consulting work. The property improvements became my afternoon therapy. I'd work in 2-hour shifts, taking mandatory breaks to prevent overexertion, another lesson learned the hard way during rehabilitation. The backyard was my primary focus, as it offered both privacy and the perfect canvas for my vision. I'd sketched out plans for raised garden beds, positioning them strategically to minimize the strain on my injured leg. The design incorporated wide, wheelchair-accessible paths, not because I needed them now, but because my doctors had warned me about potential mobility issues as I aged. The previous owner's neglect had actually worked in my favor. The overgrown state of the yard meant I could start fresh, implementing designs that would serve both practical and therapeutic purposes. I'd started by clearing out the dead vegetation, a task that proved more challenging than expected. Years of accumulated debris had to be removed before I could even begin the real work. Tom, my retired teacher neighbor, became an unexpected ally in this endeavor. He'd stop by most afternoons, offering advice about local growing seasons and which plants thrived in Charleston's humid climate. You'll want to position those tomato beds where they'll get morning sun but afternoon shade, he'd suggest, leaning on his cane. And consider some native plants along the fence line. They'll attract pollinators and require less maintenance. I appreciated his expertise, but even more, I valued his company. There's a certain loneliness that comes with transitioning to civilian life, a void left by the absence of your unit. Tom's visits helped fill that gap, providing not just gardening wisdom, but also a connection to my new community. He'd share stories about the neighborhood's history, carefully avoiding direct mentions of current HOA politics, but dropping subtle hints about the changes he'd witnessed. The front yard presented its own challenges. The grass had grown wild and uneven, with bare patches scattered throughout. I'd started by aerating the soil and reseeding, following a careful plan to create a lawn that would be both attractive and low maintenance. The flower beds required complete renovation. I removed the overgrown bushes and started preparing the soil for native South Carolina plants that would provide year-round color while supporting local wildlife. Each improvement was carefully documented in my project journal, complete with before and after photos. This wasn't just for personal satisfaction. My time in the military had taught me the value of maintaining detailed records. Every receipt was filed, every modification photographed, and every decision logged. It was a habit that would prove invaluable sooner than I expected. My disability meant I had to approach the work differently than I might have before my injury. Simple tasks like digging holes or moving stones required careful planning to avoid aggravating old wounds. I'd developed a system of using my upper body strength to compensate for my legs' limitations, and I'd modified several tools with extended handles to reduce the need for bending. The work was slower this way, but steady progress was better than a setback caused by overexertion. The neighbors seemed to appreciate my efforts. Sarah's kids would sometimes stop their bikes to watch me work, asking questions about the different plants and tools. Mr. Chen had started timing his morning walks to coincide with my outdoor sessions, often pausing to discuss his own gardening experiences in Taiwan. Even Mrs. Peterson, who rarely left her house, had sent over a plate of cookies with a note thanking me for bringing some life back to the old Jenkins place. But not everyone viewed my improvements with approval. I'd noticed increased drive-bys from certain vehicles, particularly Margaret's distinctive Range Rover. She never stopped or spoke directly to me, but I could feel her scrutiny during these passes. Sometimes she'd slow down enough to take photos. With her phone, though of what exactly I couldn't tell. The growing tension was subtle but unmistakable. Other neighbors had started warning me, in roundabout ways, about potential conflicts ahead. "You might want to check the HOA guidelines about garden structures," Sarah had mentioned one afternoon, eyeing my partially constructed raised beds. When I explained that my property wasn't under HOA jurisdiction, her relief was visible, though tinged with concern. I continued my work, maintaining my steady pace and methodical approach. Each day brought new progress. A section of fence repaired, a garden bed framed, a patch of lawn restored to health. I was creating more than just a garden. I was building a sanctuary, a place where I could continue my healing while putting down roots in my new community. Little did I know that my peaceful project was about to become the catalyst for a neighborhood power struggle that would test not just my resolve, but the very principles I'd sworn to defend. The first confrontation with Margaret came on a crisp Tuesday morning, while I was installing a section of lattice work that would eventually support climbing vegetables. The sound of her heels on the concrete walkway was distinctive, a sharp, authoritative click-clack that seemed deliberately paced. I didn't immediately turn around, finishing the securing of a support beam while mentally preparing for what I knew would be an interesting encounter. "Good morning." Her voice carried that artificial sweetness that immediately reminded me of my least favorite commanding officers, the ones who used false politeness to mask their contempt. "I'm Margaret Thompson, president of the Pine Grove Estates Homeowners Association. I don't believe we've had the pleasure of a formal introduction." Setting down my drill, I turned to face her, taking in the full picture. She stood at the edge of my property line, clipboard in hand, dressed in a powder blue business suit that probably cost more than my monthly disability check. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her smile was fixed in place like it had been painted on at a professional salon, along with her makeup. "Morning, Mom," I replied, keeping my tone neutral but firm, the way I'd been trained to address potential confrontations. "I'm James Sullivan. What can I help you with today?" I made no move to cross the yard to meet her, a deliberate choice that I could see registered in the slight narrowing of her eyes. "Well, Mr. Sullivan, I'm here to conduct our monthly property inspection. We've noticed quite a bit of activity here lately, and I need to ensure all modifications are in compliance with our community standards." She took a step forward, her clipboard raised like a shield. "I appreciate you stopping by," I responded, maintaining my position, "but I'm afraid there must be some misunderstanding. This property isn't part of the HOA. The smile on her face flickered for just a moment, like a faulty light bulb struggling to stay lit. "Oh, I think you're mistaken," she countered, her voice taking on a harder edge. "All properties in Pine Grove Estates fall under HOA jurisdiction. It's part of our charter." She took another step forward, now fully on my property. "Now, if you'll just allow me to complete my inspection, we can address any violations before they become problematic." My military training kicked in, not the combat skills, but the countless hours spent dealing with bureaucratic power plays. "Ma'am, I have the property documents right here." I gestured to my workbench, where I deliberately placed a folder containing all relevant paperwork. This house was grandfathered out of the HOA when it was established. The previous owner, Mrs. Jenkins, opted out, and that status transferred with the sale. Margaret's face underwent a fascinating transformation. The professional smile remained, but her eyes hardened into something closer to what I'd seen in interrogation rooms. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, each word precisely measured, "I don't think you understand how things work here. The HOA ensures our community maintains certain standards that protect everyone's property values. Your projects here are becoming a concern." "I understand completely," I replied, shifting my weight to ease the pressure on my bad leg. "But as I said, this property isn't under HOA jurisdiction. I have all the necessary permits from the city for my improvements, and I'm well within my legal rights." She took another step forward, her heels sinking slightly into the soft grass. "I'm going to need to see those permits. And I'll need to document the changes you're making. The board will want a full report." "No, ma'am," I said firmly, using the same tone I'd used with junior officers who overstepped their authority. "You don't have the right to inspect my property or demand to see my permits. I'm asking you to please respect the property line and leave." The painted smile finally cracked. "Do you have any idea who I am? I've been running this HOA for 7 years. I've dealt with difficult residents before, Mr. Sullivan. Military background or not, you'll find it's much easier to cooperate." That last comment, the mention of my military service, confirmed she'd been doing her homework on me. It was meant to intimidate, to show she had information about me. Instead, it just reinforced my resolve. "I'm not being difficult, Mrs. Thompson. I'm stating facts. This is private property and you're currently trespassing. I've asked you politely to leave. Please don't make me ask again." Her face flushed red beneath her makeup. "This isn't over, Mr. Sullivan, not by a long shot. You'll find that maintaining good relationships with the HOA makes life much easier. In Pine Grove Estates." "Good day, Mrs. Thompson," I replied, turning back to my lattice work, dismissing her with the same finality I'd used to end countless unnecessary meetings in the Corps. I listened as her heels clicked away, faster now, angry. Little impacts on the concrete. I didn't need to look to know she was already on her phone, likely calling her HOA board allies. This wasn't over. My training and experience told me this was just the opening salvo in what would become a protracted campaign. Tom's voice carried over the fence a few minutes later. "Well, you've done it now, James. Kicked the hornet's nest, you have." I couldn't help but smile as I responded, "Wouldn't be the first time, Tom. Wouldn't be the first time." My understanding of legal rights had been honed through years of military service, where knowing regulations could mean the difference between success and failure. After my discharge, that attention to detail had carried over into civilian life. Before purchasing the house, I'd done extensive research into property laws, HOA regulations, and homeowner rights in South Carolina. The documentation was crystal clear. When Pine Grove Estates established its HOA in 2012, Mrs. Jenkins had exercised her right to opt out, a decision documented in both county records and the original HOA charter. This wasn't just about standing my ground, it was about protecting my legal rights, something I'd sworn to defend for others and now found myself doing for my own property. That evening, after Margaret's visit, I pulled out the thick folder of documents I'd compiled: property deed, survey maps, the original HOA charter with Mrs. Jenkins' opt-out clause highlighted, and all my current building permits from the city. I spread them across my dining room table, reviewing each one carefully. The military had taught me that the best defense is thorough preparation. I also made a call to my lawyer, Michael Reeves. Unlike the stereotypical smooth-talking attorneys you see on TV, Michael was a former JAG officer who specialized in property law. He'd helped me review all the paperwork before I bought the house, and I trusted his judgment implicitly. "They can't touch you legally, James," Michael assured me over the phone, the sound of shuffling papers in the background. "Your property's exemption is ironclad, but that doesn't mean they won't try to make your life difficult. HOAs can be creative when they feel challenged." "What kind of creative are we talking about?" I asked, making notes in my project journal. "Harassment, mostly. False complaints to the city. Pressure on other residents to isolate you. I've seen cases where HOAs have tried to claim jurisdiction through various loopholes or attempted to force properties into compliance through community pressure." I thought about Margaret's thinly veiled threats. She mentioned my military background. "Been doing her homework." Michael's voice took on a harder edge. "That's concerning. Shows she's looking for leverage. Document everything, James. Every interaction, every photo she takes, every drive-by. Time, date, details. If this escalates, we want a clear paper trail." "Already on it," I replied, glancing at my security cameras. I'd installed them the day I moved in, another habit from my military days. They covered every angle of the property, with backup power and cloud storage for the footage. Good. And James, be careful about engaging with other residents about this. HOAs often use social pressure as a weapon. The less ammunition you give them, the better. After hanging up, I sat on my back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The garden was coming along nicely. The raised beds were taking shape, and the first seedlings were already pushing through the soil. This was my peace, my therapy, my way of building something positive after years of combat and destruction. The sound of a car slowing down out front caught my attention. Through the side gate, I could see Margaret's Range Rover crawling past, her phone raised to capture whatever violations she imagined she'd found. I made a note in my journal. Tuesday, 7:45 p.m., MT drive-by with photo documentation. Tom's voice carried over the fence again. "Saw Her Royal Highness paid you a visit earlier. You holding up okay?" I walked over to the fence, where Tom was pretending to trim his roses. "I'm good, just making sure all my ducks are in a row." He glanced around before speaking lower. "She'll go after the building permits next, always does. Claims they're incomplete or invalid. Had the Hendersons tied up in city paperwork for months over their deck extension." "Thanks for the heads up," I replied, making another mental note. "My permits are solid, but I'll make sure to have extra copies on hand." "Just watch yourself," Tom warned. "Margaret's got friends in the city planning office. Nothing official, mind you, but favors get called in, paperwork gets misplaced." This was familiar territory. In the military, we'd called it asymmetric warfare. When your opponent can't beat you head-on, they look for indirect ways to achieve their objectives. Margaret couldn't legally force me to join the HOA, but she could make exercising my rights as difficult as possible. I spent the rest of the evening organizing my documentation, scanning everything into digital files, and updating my security protocols. Years of military service had taught me the value of redundancy, multiple copies, multiple locations, multiple formats. If Margaret wanted to play hardball, she'd find I was more than prepared for a long campaign. Before turning in, I made one final entry in my journal. Remember, this isn't about garden beds or fences anymore. This is about standing up to bullies who think they can steamroll anyone who doesn't fall in line. Some battles choose you. The quiet of the night was broken only by the distant sound of crickets and the occasional car passing by. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, I had the satisfaction of knowing I stood on solid legal ground. Let Margaret plot and plan, I'd faced worse odds in worse places, and I hadn't backed down then either. True to my predictions, Margaret's first real move came swiftly and decisively. The morning after our confrontation, I found an official-looking envelope taped to my front door. The HOA letterhead was embossed in gold, making it look more like a formal decree than a neighborhood notice. Inside was a detailed list of alleged violations, each one typed in bold red text, as if the color alone could lend them legitimacy. Notice of multiple violations and demand for immediate compliance, the header read, followed by what could only be described as a creative interpretation of reality. According to the notice, my property was in violation of no fewer than 15 HOA bylaws, ranging from unauthorized structural modifications to non-conforming plant species selection. The document went on to demand that I cease all improvements immediately and submit a comprehensive plan for bringing the property into compliance within 48 hours. The kicker was at the bottom, a schedule of fines that would begin accumulating at $100 per day for each violation if I failed to comply. Simple math told me they were threatening me with $1,500 daily in fines. I couldn't help but laugh, which probably wasn't the reaction Margaret was hoping for. During my last deployment, I dealt with actual threat assessments that carried life or death consequences. This attempted intimidation felt almost comical in comparison. Still, I knew better than to ignore it completely. That same afternoon, I photographed the notice and sent copies to Michael, along with pictures of my ongoing projects. His response came within an hour. "They're fishing," he wrote back. "Classic intimidation tactic. They're hoping you'll either be scared enough to comply or angry enough to do something rash. Don't take the bait. Document everything, but don't engage." I was drafting a formal response when Tom called over the fence. "Got one of Margaret's love letters, did you?" He held up an identical envelope. "Apparently my bird feeder is now an unauthorized wildlife attraction device." "You too?" I asked, surprised. "I thought you were in the HOA." Tom's weathered face broke into a knowing smile. "Oh, I am. But I made the mistake of being seen talking to you yesterday. Margaret doesn't appreciate what she calls fraternization with non-compliant elements." The implications were clear. Margaret was willing to target her own HOA members if they showed any sign of supporting me. It was a classic isolation tactic, one I'd seen used in various forms throughout my military career. Cut off potential allies, make examples of supporters, force compliance through social pressure. Later that evening, Sarah hurried over while I was checking my mail. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, glancing nervously at her own house. "They're telling everyone not to interact with you. Margaret called an emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow night to discuss the growing threat to community standards." I appreciated the intel, but didn't want Sarah getting caught in the crossfire. "Thanks for the heads up, but be careful. No need to put yourself at risk." She nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. "Just watch out for the weekend. That's when they usually do their surprise inspections." As if on cue, Margaret's Range Rover made another pass, slowing to a crawl in front of my house. This time she had company. A man in the passenger seat I recognized from my property research as Gerald Wilson, the HOA Vice President and local real estate agent. I made another entry in my journal, noting the time and participants. This was escalating faster than expected, but not outside parameters. Margaret was following a predictable pattern: establish authority, issue threats, isolate the target, then escalate pressure through official channels. That night, I added additional security cameras covering my front yard and driveway. Something told me Margaret's surprise inspections might not respect property boundaries, and I wanted evidence if lines were crossed. I also backed up all my permit documentation to a secure cloud server and set up motion alerts on my phone. The whole situation reminded me of a counterinsurgency operation I'd once helped plan. Identify the opponent's strategy, anticipate their moves, and prepare countermeasures without escalating unnecessarily. The stakes were different, but the principles remained the same. As I reviewed the violation notice one more time, I couldn't help but notice the irony. Margaret's attempt to assert control was actually confirming everything I documented about the HOA's overreach. Every threatening letter, every drive-by, every attempt at isolation just added to the evidence that this was about power, not property values. I sealed my formal response letter, keeping it professional and brief. As previously stated, this property is not under HOA jurisdiction. Any attempts to enforce HOA regulations or levy fines will be considered harassment and dealt with accordingly. Please direct all future communications to my legal representative. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but I was ready. Margaret might have the HOA machinery behind her, but I had something more valuable: the law on my side and the training to stand my ground. Let her make her moves. I'd faced worse odds in combat, and I hadn't backed down then. I certainly wasn't going to back down now. The next phase of Margaret's campaign arrived exactly as I'd expected, through official channels. Early Thursday morning, a city code enforcement vehicle pulled up in front of my house. The timing wasn't coincidental. I'd just started working on installing the irrigation system for my raised beds when the inspector, clipboard in hand, made his way up my driveway. "Good morning, sir," he said, his demeanor professional but uncomfortable. "I'm David Martinez, from the City Planning Department. We've received multiple complaints about unauthorized construction on this property. I need to verify your permits and inspect the work." I'd been waiting for this move. Margaret's connection to the planning office, which Tom had warned me about, was making its first appearance. But I was prepared. "Of course, Mr. Martinez. I have all my documentation right here." I retrieved the waterproof folder I'd started, keeping in my work area specifically for this purpose. The inspector seemed surprised by my immediate cooperation. Most people probably scrambled or got defensive when he showed up. Instead, I laid out every permit, application, and approval document on my portable work table. Each one was properly filed, stamped, and current. "Everything seems to be in order," Martinez said after reviewing the papers, looking increasingly puzzled. "These complaints mentioned major structural modifications, but I'm only seeing approved garden work and basic landscaping." "That's correct," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Would you like to see the project areas? I've documented each phase of the work with photos and measurements to ensure compliance." As we walked through the property, I could see Martinez's professional demeanor shifting from suspicious to sympathetic. He'd clearly been expecting to find major violations based on the complaints. Instead, he was looking at carefully planned, properly permitted improvements that actually enhanced the property's value. "Listen," he said quietly as he finished his inspection, "I shouldn't say this, but these complaints, they're not the first ones we've received about properties in this neighborhood. There's been a pattern." I nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying explicitly. "I appreciate your thoroughness, Mr. Martinez. Would you mind providing me with a copy of your inspection report for my records?" He wrote up his findings on the spot. No violations found. All permits in order, work being conducted within approved parameters. As he handed me the carbon copy, he hesitated. "Just Keep those permits handy. Something tells me this won't be my last visit." After he left, I watched Margaret's Range Rover make another drive-by. She'd been parked down the street during the entire inspection, no doubt waiting to see me get cited for violations. The speed with which she accelerated away told me all I needed to know about her reaction to the inspector's findings. I immediately scanned the inspection report and added it to my growing digital archive of documentation. Then I called Michael to update him on the situation. "Classic move," he said when I described the inspection. "They probably filed multiple complaints hoping something would stick. When dealing with HOAs, city inspectors often find themselves caught in the middle." "Martinez hinted at a pattern of complaints," I told him. "Not surprised. Document everything, dates, times, names. If we can establish a pattern of harassment through false complaints, it strengthens our position." That afternoon, I received another HOA notice, this one claiming my property was decreasing neighborhood values and demanding I attend a special board meeting to address concerns. The timing made it clear that Margaret had prepared this notice before even seeing the results of the city inspection. I was adding this latest notice to my files when Sarah hurried over, looking nervous. "James, I thought you should know. Margaret's been showing people pictures of other neighborhoods where non-HOA properties supposedly ruined everything. She's trying to turn everyone against you." "Thanks for the warning," I replied, making sure to stay on my side of the property line. No need to give Margaret more ammunition. But be careful. Don't put yourself at risk. "It's not right," Sarah said firmly. "Some of us remember what this neighborhood was like before she took over. Before, everything had to be perfectly uniform." As she hurried back to her house, I noticed Mr. Chen watching from his driveway. He gave me a slight nod, another silent ally in this increasingly complex situation. The battle lines were being drawn, but not necessarily where Margaret thought they were. That evening, I added new entries to my journal, updating my timeline of events. The failed inspection attempt marked an escalation in tactics, moving from HOA harassment to attempting to use city resources against me. It wouldn't be the last time, but at least now I had documentation of a clean inspection to counter future complaints. As I finished my notes, I could hear Margaret's voice carrying from several houses down, where she appeared to be holding an impromptu gathering of neighbors. Her words weren't clear, but her tone was unmistakable. She was rallying her troops, preparing for her next move. I smiled to myself, remembering a lesson from my military days. Sometimes the strongest position isn't the most aggressive one. Let her make noise. Let her rally her supporters. I had something better. The law on my side and a growing file of evidence showing exactly who was really disrupting the neighborhood's peace. Just as any good strategist would, I decided it was time to seek expert counsel beyond just legal advice. The weekend after the city inspection, I reached out to Derek Hamilton, a longtime friend from my Marine Corps days, who'd become a private investigator after his own medical discharge. Having someone with his particular set of skills could prove invaluable in what was clearly becoming a complex situation. "Records are power, James," Derek said during our video call, his face serious as he reviewed the documentation I'd sent him. "And from what I'm seeing, this Margaret Thompson has quite a paper trail. Want me to do some digging?" I hesitated for a moment, considering the implications. "Nothing illegal, Derek. Just public records, anything that might help me understand what I'm really dealing with." "Roger that," he replied, using our old military shorthand. "I'll stick to the surface level. Property records, business filings, court documents. Basic background that anyone could access with enough time and knowledge." While Derek worked his magic through official channels, I focused on fortifying my position. Michael had suggested I start building relationships with other non-HOA properties in the surrounding areas. As it turned out, Pine Grove Estates wasn't the only neighborhood where Margaret's HOA had tried to extend its reach. "She tried the same thing with us last year," said Ellen Rodriguez, whose property backed up to the eastern edge of Pine Grove Estates. "We were meeting at a local coffee shop, away from Margaret's prying eyes. Claimed our fence line was affecting their property values, sent us violation notices, the whole 9 yards. We had to get a lawyer involved before she backed off." Ellen's story matched patterns I'd seen developing in my own situation. "Did she try using city inspections against you?" "Oh yeah," Ellen nodded, pulling out her phone to show me photos. 3 different inspectors in 2 months. Each time they found nothing wrong, but she kept filing complaints. Finally, the city planning office told her they wouldn't respond to any more complaints without new evidence. This information was gold. If Margaret had a history of misusing city resources to harass non-HOA properties, it could help establish a pattern of behavior. I made detailed notes of Ellen's experience, including dates and the names of the inspectors involved. Back home, I received an email from Derek that made my military training kick into high gear. "Found something interesting," he wrote. "Before moving to Pine Grove Estates, Margaret was involved in a similar situation in Colombia, different HOA, same pattern of behavior. There were several complaints filed against her for overstepping authority, but they were all mysteriously dropped before any official action was taken." I called Michael immediately to relay this information. His response was measured but optimistic. "This is useful," he said. "It establishes a history of similar behavior. If she escalates further, this background could help support a harassment case." That afternoon, while I was installing solar-powered garden lights, all within code and properly permitted, I noticed increased activity around Margaret's house. Cars coming and going, people carrying folders and papers. Through my security cameras, I caught snippets of conversations about community standards and property values. Sarah, ever my faithful source of intelligence, filled me in later via text message. "Emergency HOA board meeting at Margaret's house. They're discussing new bylaws about adjacent property influence, trying to find ways to control properties that border HOA homes." It was a clever move, I had to admit. If she couldn't control my property directly, she was looking for ways to restrict me through neighboring properties. Classic flanking maneuver. I spent that evening updating my growing case file, cross-referencing Derek's findings with my own documentation. The pattern was becoming clear. Margaret's actions weren't just about maintaining property values or community standards. This was about control, pure and simple, and she had a history of using HOA authority to exert that control beyond its legal boundaries. "Document everything," Michael had said, and I was taking that advice to heart. Every interaction, every drive-by, every whispered warning from neighbors, all of it went into my files. I'd learned in the military that the smallest detail could sometimes be the key to understanding your opponent's strategy. As I reviewed the growing evidence, a message came through from Derek. "Found something else. Might want to look into the HOA's financial records from the past few years. Some interesting patterns in their community improvement expenditures." I made a note to discuss this with Michael. If there were financial irregularities in the HOA's operations, it could explain Margaret's aggressive behavior toward non-member properties. Was she trying to expand the HOA's jurisdiction to cover up something else? The pieces were starting to come together, but I knew better than to jump to conclusions without solid evidence. For now, I would continue my defensive strategy, document everything, maintain clear boundaries, and prepare for whatever move Margaret might make next. As night fell, I did one final check of my security cameras and updated my journal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but I was better prepared now. Knowledge, as they say, is power, and thanks to Derek's investigation, I was beginning to understand exactly what kind of battle I was fighting. The surveillance phase of Margaret's campaign intensified throughout the following week. Her Range Rover became such a regular feature outside my house that I started timing my yard work to coincide with her drive-bys. Every time she passed, phone raised to document whatever violations she imagined, I made sure to wave pleasantly. A small psychological operation that I knew would get under her skin. But it wasn't just Margaret anymore. Other vehicles started making regular appearances. Gerald Wilson's silver Mercedes, the HOA secretary's red Volvo, and various other board members' cars. They were coordinating their surveillance, trying to create a constant presence that would make me feel watched and pressured. "They're documenting everything," Tom warned me one evening, speaking quietly over the fence. "Every plant you put in, every tool you leave out, every person who visits. Margaret's got them all taking notes and photos." I had to admire the thoroughness of their operation, even if their intent was hostile. "Let them watch," I replied, adjusting one of my security cameras. "I'm not doing anything wrong, and every minute they spend surveilling me is documented on my cameras." The surveillance wasn't limited to drive-bys anymore. Board members had started walking their dogs past my house at regular intervals, phones always at the ready. Some would stand at the edge of my property line, pretending to chat while taking photos. It was almost comical how obvious they were. Derek's latest report added an interesting layer to the situation. "They've created a shared cloud folder for all their documentation," he informed me. "Everything gets uploaded and categorized. They're building their own case file, but from what I can see, it's mostly photos of perfectly normal yard work and legitimate improvements." I couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. They were essentially creating a detailed record of my property. Improvements, complete with timestamps and multiple angles. If anything, their surveillance was helping me document my compliance with all applicable codes and regulations. But Margaret's team wasn't just watching. They were also trying to gather intelligence through other means. Sarah reported that questions were being asked about my schedule, my visitors, my daily routines. The HOA board had even started keeping track of when my lights were on and off, trying to establish patterns they could use against me. They asked me about your disability, Sarah admitted during one of her quick visits. "Wanted to know if you were really injured or just using it as an excuse for the garden modifications. Margaret suggested that if you were well enough to do yard work, you might be committing disability fraud." That particular bit of intelligence made my blood boil, but I kept my cool. It was another tactic, trying to provoke an emotional response that they could use against me. Instead of reacting, I added it to my growing file of documented harassment. The surveillance reached a new level when I noticed small flags appearing along my property line, each one marked with a different color, corresponding to alleged violations. Noted in their latest notice: red for unauthorized structures, my raised beds; yellow for non-conforming vegetation, my native plant garden; blue for improper maintenance, my ongoing work areas. I photographed each flag's placement, noting how they were technically on HOA property, but positioned to create the impression of violations on my land. It was a clever visual tactic designed to make my property look problematic to anyone passing by. Michael advised me to maintain my current strategy. "They're trying to build a case for nuisance complaints," he explained. "Keep working as you have been, but make sure every improvement is clearly documented and photographed. We want our records to be more detailed than theirs." I took his advice to heart, adding my own documentation system to counter theirs. Every morning I'd photograph my property from multiple angles, creating a daily record of its actual condition. Every improvement was logged, with before and after photos, along with copies of relevant permits and approvals. The psychological aspect of constant surveillance wasn't lost on me. It was designed to create stress, to make the target feel unsafe in their own home. But my military training had prepared me for this kind of pressure. I understood the importance of maintaining normal routines while under observation. Late one evening, as I was reviewing my security footage, I noticed something interesting. The pattern of surveillance had gaps, specific times when no one from the HOA board was watching. They were creating a show of constant monitoring, but their actual coverage had holes. I made note of these gaps in my journal, not because I needed to hide anything, but because understanding their patterns could help me predict their next moves. Every strategy has its weaknesses, and their attempt at total surveillance was revealing theirs. As I finished my evening security check, I caught sight of Margaret's Range Rover making one final pass. In the darkness, her phone's camera flash was clearly visible as she took more photos. I smiled and gave her my usual friendly wave, then added another entry to my log. 22:15 hours. MT drive-by with photo documentation, flash photography in darkness, images likely poor quality. Let them watch. Let them document. Every photo they took, every note they made, every flag they planted was just adding to my own evidence of their coordinated harassment campaign. Sometimes the best defense is simply letting your opponents' actions work against them. The protective measures I'd put in place proved their worth sooner than expected. One Wednesday morning, my phone buzzed with a security alert while I was working in my home office. The camera facing my backyard had detected movement at 10:45 a.m., well outside my usual gardening hours. Pulling up the live feed, I watched as Gerald Wilson, Margaret's right-hand man on the HOA board, carefully made his way along my property line. He wasn't just doing his usual surveillance. He was physically measuring my garden beds with a tape measure, reaching over my fence to do so. The camera caught everything in crisp, clear detail, including the moment he actually stepped onto my property to get a better angle. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I let the cameras record his entire inspection, documenting every measurement he took and every boundary he crossed. This was exactly the kind of evidence Michael had advised me to collect: clear, undeniable proof of trespassing and unauthorized property inspection. Got him, I muttered to myself, downloading the footage and immediately backing it up to my secure cloud storage. Years of handling sensitive military data had taught me the importance of immediate backup protocols. Later that afternoon, I received what was clearly a related notice from the HOA. This one claimed my garden beds exceeded the maximum allowed dimensions by precisely 3 inches, the same measurements Gerald had taken during his unauthorized morning visit. They hadn't even tried to hide the connection. I called Michael immediately, sending him the security footage along with the new notice. His response was measured but optimistic. "This is perfect," he said. "They've given us exactly what we need." Documented evidence of trespassing followed by an official HOA action based on illegally obtained measurements. Don't respond to the notice yet. Let me draft something formal. While waiting for Michael's response, I noticed increased activity around my property. Margaret's Range Rover made several passes, and other board members seemed to be taking turns monitoring my house. They were waiting for a reaction, trying to gauge if I discovered their morning inspection. Tom caught my attention from his yard, making a subtle gesture toward his phone. A text message arrived moments later. "Emergency HOA meeting called for tonight. They're saying they have concrete evidence of violations. Thought you should know." I thanked him for the intel and added it to my growing documentation. The timing was telling. They were moving quickly to act on their illegally obtained measurements, probably hoping to establish some kind of official record before I could challenge their methods. Sarah dropped by under the pretense of retrieving an imaginary lost ball from her kids. "They're planning something big," she whispered. "Margaret's been on the phone all day with someone from the city planning office, kept mentioning structural violations and safety concerns." This matched the pattern Derek had uncovered in Margaret's previous HOA activities, using illegally obtained information to file official complaints, then trying to legitimize the information after the fact through formal channels. I spent the evening updating my case file and reviewing the security footage again. Gerald's trespassing was clear and unambiguous. The cameras had caught him from multiple angles, including close-ups of him reaching over my fence and stepping onto my property. The timestamp on the footage perfectly preceded the HOA's violation. Notice, establishing a clear cause and effect relationship. We've got them, Michael confirmed when he called back. The notice they sent specifically cites measurements that could only have been obtained through trespassing. It's a direct link between their illegal actions and their official HOA functions. This is exactly the kind of evidence we need to establish a pattern of harassment. He advised me to maintain my routine and not confront them about the trespassing. Yet, let them think they're being clever, he suggested. The more they act on their illegally obtained information, the stronger our case becomes. That night, I added new security measures, motion-activated lights, and additional cameras covering potential blind spots. I also started a new section in my documentation specifically for trespassing incidents, suspecting this wouldn't be the last time they tried to gather information directly from my property. As I finished my evening security check, I noticed Margaret's car parked down the street, its outline barely visible in the growing darkness. She was watching, probably hoping to see some sign that her latest move had rattled me. Instead, I calmly went about my normal routine, even spending some time working in the garden with my new motion-activated lights, providing excellent illumination. Let them think they had the upper hand. Let them believe their tactics were working. Every illegal measurement, every trespassing incident, every coordinated action just added to the evidence we were collecting. Sometimes the best strategy is to let your opponent think they're winning, while they dig themselves deeper into a hole of their own making. The HOA's demands for my attendance at their board meetings had become increasingly aggressive. The latest notice, delivered by certified mail to ensure I couldn't claim ignorance, demanded my presence at what they called a mandatory compliance review session. The letter was printed on expensive cardstock, embossed with gold lettering, as if fancy paper somehow granted them authority they didn't legally possess. Final notice of mandatory attendance, the header proclaimed in bold text. The letter went on to detail a litany of alleged violations, each one more creative than the last. They'd even included glossy photos, courtesy of their surveillance campaign, with red circles highlighting their supposed concerns. I had to admire their dedication to documentation, even if it was all baseless. What they didn't realize was that every official notice, every certified letter, every piece of correspondence was strengthening my position, not theirs. Each demand for compliance from an organization that had no authority over my property was another piece of evidence for my harassment case. "They're getting desperate," Michael observed when I forwarded him the latest notice. "This kind of escalation usually means they're running out of options. The more aggressive they get, the clearer it becomes that this is harassment." The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center. While I had no intention of attending, doing so might imply I recognized their authority. I did plan to document everything about it. Derek had already arranged for a licensed private investigator to observe the meeting legally from public spaces. "Standard surveillance package," Derek assured me. "Photos, audio from public areas, license plate documentation of attendees, all completely legal and above board. If they're planning something, we'll know about it." The day of the meeting, activity around my house intensified. Board members made repeated drive-bys, probably hoping to catch me doing something they could. add to their presentation. Margaret's Range Rover was practically wearing a groove in the street, her phone constantly raised to document my continued defiance of her authority. Sarah texted me updates throughout the day. They're setting up early. Brought in a projector and screen. Margaret's got some kind of PowerPoint presentation ready. Tom added his own intelligence. Full board attendance required. They're calling it a special legislative session, whatever that means. I maintained my normal routine, working in my garden during the afternoon, making sure my security cameras captured my calm, lawful activities. Every so often, I'd wave pleasantly at the passing parade of HOA vehicles, a subtle psychological operation that I knew would be driving Margaret crazy. At 6:45 p.m., right as the meeting was scheduled to begin, I received a series of texts from Sarah. Standing room only. Margaret's on a tear about property values. She's showing before and after photos of your yard, but they're edited to look worse. Now she's talking about getting the city involved. I stayed in my garden, visible, from the street, deliberately working on my raised beds under the newly installed security lights. Let them have their meeting, let them make their plans and issue their threats. Every minute they spent plotting against me was another minute I spent documenting their harassment. The meeting ran for over 2 hours. My security cameras caught the exodus of vehicles afterward, many stopping briefly in front of my house. Margaret's Range Rover lingered longest, idling at the curb, while she appeared to be taking notes or photos in the darkness. The next morning, another certified letter arrived, this one even thicker than the last. Inside was a formal resolution of non-compliance, passed unanimously at the meeting, declaring my property a threat to community standards and demanding immediate corrective action. They'd included a detailed list of required changes, complete with architectural drawings of how my property should look according to their standards. The level of detail was almost impressive. They'd literally designed an entire landscaping plan for a property they had no authority over. "This is getting better and better," Michael said when I sent him the documents. "They've now officially voted to take action against a non-member property. Every board member who signed this resolution has essentially documented their participation in the harassment campaign." I added the latest documents to my growing file, noting how their demands had escalated over time. What had started as simple violation notices had grown into detailed architectural plans and formal resolutions. Each escalation, each demand, each piece of certified mail helped establish the pattern of coordinated harassment we were documenting. That evening, as I reviewed the security footage from the past 24 hours, I noticed something interesting. The frequency of drive-bys had increased, but there was something different about them. The board members seemed more agitated, less confident in their surveillance. Whatever had happened at that meeting, whatever plans they'd made, they weren't as sure of themselves as they had been. I made a note in my journal: opposition showing signs of uncertainty. Escalating actions may indicate desperation rather than strength. Maintain current strategy. Document everything, stay within legal bounds, let them continue to overplay their hand. The physical boundary violation happened on a quiet Sunday morning. I was inside, reviewing security footage from the previous day, when multiple alerts started flooding my phone. The cameras caught everything in crystal clear detail. Margaret, accompanied by Gerald Wilson and 2 other board members, had entered my backyard through the side gate. The lock had been cut cleanly. This wasn't forced entry from frustration, but a planned operation. My military training kicked in immediately. Stay calm, assess the situation, document everything. Through my security monitors, I watched as they moved methodically through my garden, measuring beds, taking photos, and making notes on their clipboards. This wasn't a random inspection. They were executing a coordinated plan. I called 911 first. reporting a breaking and entering in progress. Then I called Michael, putting him on speaker while keeping my eyes on the monitors. "They're in my backyard right now," I informed him, my voice steady. "Police are on the way. I have everything on camera." "Perfect," Michael replied. "Don't confront them. Let the police handle it. Just keep recording." The cameras captured Margaret's confident stride as she moved through my garden, pointing out various features to her companions. They were so focused on their documentation that they didn't notice the police cruiser pulling up until the officers were already approaching my front door. I met the officers at the door, Officers Rodriguez and Chen, according to their nameplates. "The intruders are still in my backyard," I informed them quietly. "I have them on camera cutting the lock and entering the property." What happened next was almost surreal to watch. As the officers moved around to the back, Margaret's group finally noticed them. The change in their demeanor was instant, from authoritative to flustered in seconds. "Oh, thank goodness you're here, officers," Margaret's voice carried clearly through the security camera's audio. "We're conducting an official HOA inspection. This property has multiple violations that needed immediate attention." Officer Rodriguez's response was professional but firm. "Ma'am, did you have permission to enter this property?" "We don't need permission," Margaret replied, her voice taking on that familiar condescending tone. "As HOA President, I have the authority to inspect any property in the neighborhood." "Actually," I said, stepping into the backyard with my property, documentation in hand, "this property isn't part of the HOA, and they just broke in by cutting my lock." The next few minutes were a masterclass in professional police work. The officers separated the group, taking individual statements. They photographed the cut lock, documented the intrusion, and reviewed my security footage right there on my phone. Margaret's story began to unravel quickly. When asked for documentation of her authority to enter the property, she could only produce HOA bylaws that didn't apply to my land. When questioned about the cut lock, she claimed it was in disrepair, a claim immediately disproven by my photos of the intact lock from the previous evening. "We had no choice," she finally declared, her composure cracking. "He's destroying property values with these unauthorized modifications. We had to document the violations." Officer Chen was particularly interested in the cutting of the lock. "That shows premeditation," he noted, taking detailed photos. "This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision." The officers took statements from everyone involved, including me. I provided copies of all relevant documentation, property records, previous harassment incidents, security footage. They were particularly interested in the pattern of escalation leading up to this incident. As they led Margaret and her group out of my backyard, I could hear her still trying to justify their actions. "This is a community standards issue. We have the right to protect our neighborhood." "No, ma'am," Officer Rodriguez replied firmly. "What you have is a criminal trespassing charge and possibly breaking and entering. You'll be receiving a summons to appear in court." After they left, I immediately began documenting everything while it was fresh. Photos of all damage, backup copies of the security footage, detailed notes about every word spoken. Michael was already working on amendments to our harassment case, incorporating this latest and most serious incident. "This is a game changer," he said during our follow-up call. "They've crossed the line from harassment into criminal behavior. The physical breaking of the lock, the coordinated group entry. This is exactly the kind of evidence we needed." Later that evening, as I installed a new, heavier-duty lock on my gate, I noticed the neighborhood was unusually quiet. No drive-bys, no surveillance, no clipboard-wielding board members walking their dogs past my house. The police response had clearly shaken their confidence. Tom called over the fence as I was finishing up. "Word's spreading fast," he reported. "Some board members are already talking about resigning." They didn't sign up for criminal charges. I made one final entry in my journal before turning in. Significant escalation today. Opposition crossed physical boundary, triggering law enforcement response. Their miscalculation may prove to be the turning point in this conflict. Maintain vigilance. Cornered opponents are often the most dangerous. The official response to the break-in came swiftly. By Monday morning, the police report had been filed and copies were sent to all involved. Parties. I received my copy via email. 8 pages of detailed documentation, including photographs of the cut lock, statements from all parties, and references to my security footage. Officer Rodriguez had been particularly thorough in noting the discrepancies. In Margaret's story, her initial claim about performing an emergency inspection fell apart under basic questioning, especially when confronted with evidence of the premeditated lock cutting. The report also noted the HOA documents she'd presented, specifically highlighting that they had no legal authority over my property. "This is exactly what we needed," Michael said during our morning briefing call. "The police report establishes independent verification of their actions. Their behavior has escalated from civil harassment to criminal trespassing. This changes everything." I spent the morning with a locksmith, upgrading all my exterior security. New deadbolts, reinforced, Dr. frames, and a state-of-the-art electronic lock for the gate that would log every access attempt. The locksmith, a retired Marine himself, understood exactly what I was dealing with. "Seen this before," he commented while installing the gate lock. "HOA's getting too big for their britches. Had a lady last month try to force her way into someone's backyard, ended up facing charges too." By noon, the neighborhood grapevine was buzzing with activity. Sarah texted updates throughout the day. Emergency board meeting called. 3 board members didn't show up. Margaret's trying to spin it as a misunderstanding. Derek's sources provided additional context. 2 board members have already contacted lawyers, he reported. They're worried about personal liability. Gerald Wilson is particularly concerned. Apparently, he's got a real estate license he can't afford to lose over this. The afternoon brought another development. A city code enforcement vehicle pulled up, but it wasn't Martinez this time. Instead, a senior inspector named Jenkins introduced himself, explaining that he was conducting a review of all recent complaints filed against my property. "We've noticed some irregularities in how these complaints were handled," he explained, reviewing my documentation. "Multiple inspections requested without new evidence, pressure applied to our junior inspectors, attempts to expedite violations. We're conducting an internal review." I showed him everything, my permits, the improvement plans, the documentation of harassment. He was particularly interested in the pattern of complaints that had followed Martinez's initial clean inspection. "This helps clarify some things," Jenkins said as he finished his review. "I'll be implementing some changes in how we handle complaints from this HOA. They won't be able to use our office as a harassment tool anymore." As he left, I noticed Margaret's Range Rover driving past, but for the first time, she didn't slow down or take photos. The police report had clearly rattled her usual confidence. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor. Gerald Wilson approached my front door, looking considerably less sure of himself than he had during the break-in. He waited until I opened the door, but remained on the public sidewalk. "I want to make a deal," he said without preamble. "I've got a family, a business. I can't afford to have this on my record." "That should have been a consideration before you participated in breaking and entering," I replied calmly. "Look," he continued, glancing nervously over his shoulder, "I can provide documentation, emails, meeting minutes, everything showing how this whole campaign was planned. Margaret's been manipulating everyone, using the HOA for personal vendettas." I maintained my neutral expression. "Any documentation you have should be provided to the police and your lawyer. I'm not in a position to make deals." He nodded, understanding the message. As he turned to leave, he paused. "She's not going to stop, you know. This isn't just about your property anymore. She can't afford to lose control." I added the interaction to my case file, including Gerald's implied offer of evidence. His visit suggested the HOA's united front was cracking under pressure, exactly as my military training had predicted. When facing consequences, alliances of convenience often dissolved. Michael was particularly interested in Gerald's mention of documentation. If he's willing to turn over evidence, it could blow this whole thing wide open. The HOA board might save themselves by throwing Margaret under the bus. The rest of the evening remained quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. No drive-bys, no surveillance, no subtle intimidation attempts. The neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I used the piece to update my security footage archives and case documentation. Gerald's visit might signal the beginning of the HOA's collapse, but experience had taught me never to assume victory until it was absolutely certain. Margaret might be on the defensive, but that could make her more dangerous than ever. The confrontation at the official HOA meeting wasn't my choice, but when it came, I was ready. After the break-in incident, Margaret had escalated further by calling an emergency session of the full HOA membership. The topic: addressing immediate threats to community standards and property values. The meeting was scheduled for the community center, and despite my status as a non-member, I received a formal summons to attend. This time, however, the tone was different. Instead of demands and threats, the letter almost seemed pleading, citing community harmony and mutual understanding as reasons for my attendance. "They're desperate," Michael observed during our pre-meeting strategy call. "The criminal charges have them scared, and they're trying to find a way out that saves face. But be careful. Cornered opponents are often the most dangerous." I decided to attend, but on my terms. I brought a digital recorder, a complete copy of my documentation, and most importantly, my calm demeanor. Years of military briefings had taught me the value of composed professionalism in hostile situations. The community center was packed when I arrived. Every HOA member seemed to be present, along with a few faces I didn't recognize, probably lawyers based on their attire and demeanor. Margaret sat at the front table with what remained of her board, though several chairs were conspicuously empty. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret began, her voice carrying that forced cheerfulness I'd come to know well. "We're here to address serious concerns about property maintenance and community standards." "You mean we're here to discuss your criminal charges?" a voice interrupted from the back. It was Mr. Chen, usually so quiet, now standing with unexpected authority. "Breaking and entering, trespassing, harassment. These are the real issues." The room erupted in murmurs. Margaret's face flushed, but she tried to maintain control. "Those allegations are a misunderstanding that will be resolved in due course. Tonight we're focusing on what?" Another voice cut in, Sarah, standing despite nervous glances from those around her. "On how you've been using the HOA to bully everyone who doesn't follow your personal vision. On how you've turned our neighborhood into a surveillance state." I remained silent, watching the dynamic unfold. More voices joined in, years of pent-up frustration finally finding release. Stories emerged of other harassment campaigns, of selective enforcement, of personal vendettas carried out under the guise of community standards. Finally, Margaret slammed her gavel down. "This is about property values. Everything I've done has been to protect our investments, our community." "No," I said, standing slowly. The room fell silent. "This is about power and control. Let me show you exactly what it's about." I connected my laptop to the projector they'd set up, displaying a careful timeline of events: the harassment, the surveillance, the escalating threats, all meticulously documented with photos, videos, and official records. "This isn't about property values," I continued, my voice steady. "My improvements have all been properly permitted, professionally designed, and actually increase property values. This is about the abuse of authority. Authority you don't legally have over my property. I played selected clips from my security cameras showing the coordinated surveillance, the trespassing, the break-in. The room watched in silence as their HOA leadership was exposed. As a veteran, I added, I swore an oath to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I never expected to find myself defending against petty tyranny in my own neighborhood. But here we are. Margaret tried to interrupt, but Gerald Wilson, perhaps seeing an opportunity to save himself, spoke up. The board needs to answer for this. We're facing criminal charges because we followed your lead, Margaret. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence. The next hour was chaos, but organized chaos. Years of suppressed grievances poured out. Other residents began sharing their own stories of intimidation and harassment. Someone produced HOA financial records showing questionable expenditures on security measures and community enforcement. Through it all, I stayed quiet, letting the community work through its own revelation. My military training had taught me that sometimes the best strategy is to let your opponent's position collapse under its own weight. As the meeting dissolved into various motions and votes, I packed up my materials and prepared to leave. Tom caught up with me at the door. "You did it," he said quietly. "You broke her power just by standing your ground." "The community did it," I corrected him. "They just needed to see that someone could stand up to her and survive." As I walked home in the growing darkness, I could hear raised voices still coming from the community center. Margaret's carefully constructed authority was crumbling, brought down not just by her criminal actions against me, but by the weight of all her past abuses finally coming to light. I made one final entry in my journal that night. Community meeting marks turning point. Opposition support structure collapsing. Maintain vigilance. Final phase of conflict may be most volatile. Victory in sight but not yet secured. Margaret's public meltdown during the confrontation was as spectacular as it was inevitable. After the community turned against her at the HOA meeting, her carefully maintained facade of professional authority crumbled completely. Like many who abuse power, when that power was threatened, she lashed out dramatically. Standing at the podium, her face flushed with a mix of rage and humiliation, Margaret's composure finally shattered. "You ungrateful people have no idea what I've done for this community," she shouted, her voice rising to a pitch that made the microphone squeal. "I've maintained our property values. I've protected our standards. I've kept the riffraff out." The room fell silent at that last comment, all eyes shifting between her and me. The implication was clear. As a disabled veteran who didn't conform to her vision of the neighborhood, I was the riffraff she'd tried so hard to keep out. "And you," she turned to me, pointing an accusing finger, "you come in here with your military background, thinking the rules don't apply to you. Acting like your service somehow puts you above our community standards." I remained seated, calm and silent, letting her words hang in the air. My military training had taught me that when an opponent is self-destructing, the best strategy is to let them continue. "Do you know what happens to property values when people just do whatever they want?" she continued, her voice becoming more shrill. "When they build whatever they please, when they plant vegetables instead of proper landscaping, when they turn their yards into some kind of rehabilitation project." That last bit triggered several gasps from the audience. Making light of a veteran's disability was apparently a step too far for many residents. Mr. Chen stood up, his usually quiet demeanor replaced with visible anger. "My son served in Iraq," he said, his voice firm. "He also needed rehabilitation when he came home. Are you suggesting he wouldn't be welcome in your perfect community either?" Margaret seemed to realize she'd crossed a line, but like many backed into a corner, she doubled down instead of retreating. "This isn't about his service. This is about maintaining standards, about protecting our investments. He broke into our HOA computer systems, accessed private records. That's a lie, I finally spoke, my voice calm but carrying clearly through the room. I'm a cybersecurity consultant. I don't need to hack anything. Every piece of evidence I have was legally obtained through public records and my own security systems. The room erupted again, but this time the anger was directed squarely at Margaret. Years of pent-up frustration with her tyrannical rule found their voice. Stories began pouring out of selective enforcement, of personal vendettas, of using HOA authority to settle scores. "You fined me for my Christmas lights being too bright," one resident called out. "You tried to force me to paint my house beige when I had city approval for light blue," another added. "You threatened to put a lien on my house because my roses were the wrong shade of red." Each accusation seemed to fuel Margaret's rage further. Her face contorted with anger as she realized her control was slipping away. In a final dramatic gesture, she swept her arms across the podium, sending papers flying. "Fine, let it all fall apart. Let the neighborhood go to hell. But don't come crying to me when your property values plummet because of his—" She gestured wildly at my presentation still showing on the screen, his military victory garden, and his security cameras, and his... She seemed to run out of words, standing there, breathing heavily, her perfectly styled hair now disheveled, her professional demeanor completely shattered. The transformation from powerful HOA president to ranting, desperate woman was stark and uncomfortable to watch. Gerald Wilson, perhaps seeing an opportunity to distance himself from the sinking ship, stood up. "I think we've heard enough. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the president." "You can't do that," Margaret shrieked, but her voice was drowned out by numerous seconds to the motion. As the vote was called, she grabbed her designer handbag and stormed toward the exit, pausing only to point at me one final time. "This isn't over. You haven't heard the last from me." The room watched in stunned silence as she pushed through the doors, her heels clicking rapidly on the concrete outside. Through the windows, we could see her practically running to her Range Rover, climbing in and speeding away with a squeal of tires. I made a mental note to have my security cameras recording when I got home. Something told me Margaret's meltdown wouldn't end with her dramatic exit from the community center. In my experience, when someone loses power they've held for a long time, their final actions can be the most dangerous. Tom leaned over to me as the meeting dissolved into procedural discussions about emergency board elections. "Well, that was something you don't see every day." "Actually," I replied quietly, "in the military I saw it more often than you'd think. Power corrupts, but the loss of power reveals." The temporary lull that followed Margaret's public meltdown was deceptive. For 3 days, the neighborhood experienced an unusual quiet. No Range Rover drive-bys, no clipboard-wielding board members, no surveillance of any kind. Even the regular dog walkers who'd been reporting on my activities seemed to have found new routes. "It's too quiet," I told Michael during our daily update call. "In combat, this kind of sudden silence usually meant the enemy was regrouping, planning something bigger." "I agree," he replied. "The criminal charges are still pending, and she hasn't filed any formal response yet. Her lawyer would have advised her to lay low, but knowing her pattern of behavior..." He didn't need to finish the thought. We both knew this wasn't over. Margaret had invested too much of her identity in her role as HOA president to simply walk away after such a public humiliation. The neighborhood itself was in a state of transition. The remaining board members had called for emergency elections, but there was confusion about procedures, access to accounts, and the status of ongoing HOA business. Years of Margaret's micromanagement had left few people understanding how things actually worked. Sarah kept me updated on the community chatter. "Nobody's seen Margaret since the meeting," she reported, "but there's been activity at her house late at night. Cars coming and going, lights on in her home office until dawn. Tom added his own observations during our evening fence conversations. She's been making calls, lots of them. I can see her pacing in her upstairs window, phone to her ear, gesturing like she's arguing with someone. I maintained my regular routine, but increased my security measures. More cameras, better lighting, and a new system that would alert me to any unusual activity in the neighborhood, not just on my property. My military training had taught me that the quiet period before an attack was the best time to strengthen your defenses. Derek's sources provided additional intelligence. She's been reaching out to HOA presidents in other communities, he reported. Something about forming a coalition to protect property values from dangerous precedents. Also made several calls to the city planning office, but they're not taking her calls anymore. On the fourth day, small signs of activity began to emerge. A few of Margaret's most loyal supporters were seen going in and out of her house, carrying folders and laptops. Her Range Rover remained in the driveway, but other vehicles would arrive, stay for hours, then leave late at night. Classic reorganization pattern, I noted in my journal. Opposition regrouping, likely planning counter-offensive. Maintain vigilance, document all unusual activity. The first concrete evidence of her planning came from an unexpected source. Mr. Chen's daughter, who worked at a local print shop, reported that Margaret had ordered hundreds of flyers and large format posters. The content was still unknown, but the quantity suggested a major propaganda campaign was in the works. I used the quiet time to reinforce my position. Working with Michael, we organized all our documentation into clear chronological order. Every incident, every piece of evidence, every witness statement was catalogued and backed up. If Margaret was planning something, we would be ready. The security cameras caught her first post-meltdown appearance on day 5. At 3 a.m., she emerged from her house alone, walking the neighborhood with a notebook and phone. She passed my property several times, taking notes but no photos. Her behavior was different now, more calculated, less openly aggressive. She's doing recon, I told Michael during our morning briefing. Planning something but being more careful. About documentation. Classic behavior for someone facing criminal charges, he agreed. She's learned from her mistakes, but that might make her more dangerous, not less. By the end of the week, the pattern was clear. Margaret was operating differently now, working through proxies, moving more carefully, but definitely still active. The late-night meetings at her house continued, but participants were now parking around the corner, trying to be less obvious about their involvement. I added extra backup systems to my security setup and made sure all my documentation was stored in multiple secure locations. Experience had taught me that when an opponent gets quieter, more methodical, they're usually planning something significant. The calm before the storm, Tom observed one evening, watching another unmarked car leave. Margaret's house. She's not done with this neighborhood, not by a long shot. I nodded, remembering similar situations from my military days. The quieter they get, the more you need to watch them. She's not retreating, she's regrouping. That night I made a final entry in my journal, Day 7 of quiet period, opposition showing signs of organized planning, previous erratic behavior replaced by methodical preparation. Experience suggests significant counter-offensive in development. Maintain enhanced security. Protocols and documentation procedures, the real battle may be just beginning. The real revelation about Margaret's activities came from an unexpected source. One of the junior accountants at the firm handling the HOA's books contacted Michael with concerns about what he'd found while preparing for the annual audit. The patterns he'd discovered painted a disturbing picture of how Margaret had really been operating. "You need to see this," Michael said during an encrypted video call, sharing his screen filled with spreadsheets and financial documents. She wasn't just using the HOA for power, she was using it for profit. The documents revealed a complex web of connections between Margaret's personal business interests and HOA contracts, landscaping services, maintenance companies, even the security firm that monitored the community. All had hidden ties to shell companies Margaret had created shortly after taking control of the HOA. She's been steering contracts to her own companies, Michael explained, highlighting various transactions, overcharging for services, creating unnecessary work, then pocketing the difference through her shell corporations. The forced compliance, inspections, the mandatory upgrades, it was all feeding into her network. The numbers were staggering. Over her 7-year reign, Margaret had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars through this scheme. Every violation notice, every mandatory improvement, every community enhancement project had been another opportunity to profit from her position. This explains her obsession with my property, I realized, thinking back to her increasingly desperate attempts to force compliance. A non-HOA property represented not just a challenge to her authority, but a threat to her profit margin. Derek's investigation added another layer to the revelation, found connections to similar schemes in her previous neighborhood, he reported. Same pattern, take control of the HOA, create shell companies, profit from enforcement. She left just before the audit there, too. The implications were serious. This wasn't just HOA overreach or power abuse. This was systematic fraud. Every resident who'd been forced to use approved contractors for their improvements had unknowingly been feeding Margaret's scheme. The criminal charges for breaking into your property might be the least of her problems, Michael observed. This is wire fraud, money laundering, possibly RICO violations, depending on how deep it goes. I spent hours reviewing the documentation, my military training in intelligence analysis helping me piece together the bigger picture. Margaret's aggressive enforcement wasn't just about control. It was about maintaining a system that had made her wealthy at her neighbor's expense. The accountant had provided records showing how Margaret manipulated property violations to create work for her companies. A simple fence repair would be rejected multiple times, forcing homeowners to use her approved contractors. Garden improvements would be denied until residents hired her landscaping service. Even the security cameras she'd required for community safety were supplied by one of her shell companies. She didn't just want to control your property, Michael explained. She needed to, because every independent property owner represented a crack in her system. If people realized they could maintain their homes without her approved contractors. The revelation explained so much about her escalating behavior. My improvements, done independently and properly permitted, threatened to expose the fact that her mandatory services weren't necessary. Every successful project I completed was proof that her system of control was built on lies. Sarah's text messages took on new meaning in light of this discovery. Emergency meeting at Margaret's again. They're shredding documents, lots of them. I immediately called Michael. We need to move on this, I said. If she's destroying evidence. Already on it, he replied. I've contacted the relevant authorities. The accountant's records give us enough to trigger a formal investigation. Her little document shredding party won't help her now. That evening, I noticed increased activity around Margaret's house. Cars coming and going, people carrying boxes and files. Through my security cameras, I could see lights on in her home office late into the night. Classic signs of preparation for flight, I noted in my journal. Subject displaying behavior consistent with imminent departure, increased document destruction, asset movement, unusual hours of activity. Tom confirmed my suspicions during our nightly fence chat. Moving company scheduled for next week, he reported. She's telling people it's just temporary, that she's taking a break while things settle down. I made sure all our evidence was secured and backed up in multiple locations. If Margaret was planning to run, she might make one final attempt to cover her tracks. My security cameras caught her making multiple passes by my house that night, slower than usual, studying everything with an intensity that set off all my tactical warning bells. "She's not done," I told Michael during our final call of the day. "Someone willing to run this kind of scheme for years won't just walk away. She's planning something." "Agreed," he replied. "But this time, we know what we're really dealing with. Keep your security tight. The next few days will be crucial." Compiling the evidence against Margaret became a full-time operation. With the help of Michael's legal team and Derek's investigative resources, we began assembling a comprehensive case file that went far beyond simple HOA harassment. The financial records told a story of systematic fraud that had impacted every homeowner in Pine Grove Estates. "Look at this pattern," Derek pointed out during our secure video conference. On screen, he shared a detailed timeline of Margaret's activities. Every major HOA initiative coincided with the creation of a new shell company. The mandatory security system upgrade, a week after she formed Elite Community Protection Services LLC, the neighborhood-wide landscaping requirement, right after Premium Property Maintenance Solutions was registered. The documentation was damning. Bank records showed millions flowing through these companies, all ultimately traceable back to Margaret through a complex web of nominees and shelf corporations. She hadn't just been forcing people to improve their properties, she'd been forcing them to use her companies for the work. The real genius of it was the layering, Michael explained, highlighting various transactions. She'd have one shell company issue a violation notice, another company perform the mandatory inspection, and a third company do the required work. Each step generated fees, and she was profiting from all of them. Sarah had become our inside source for current HOA activities, risking Margaret's retaliation to keep us informed. "They're trying to delete everything," she reported via encrypted message. Board members were told to wipe their computers and phones. Someone brought in a professional data destruction service. But Margaret's attempt to cover her tracks came in too late. The accountant had already provided copies of years' worth of records, and Derek's investigation had uncovered paper trails that couldn't be erased. Each new piece of evidence we found revealed another layer of her scheme. The property values argument was just a smokescreen, I noted, reviewing the latest findings. She used it to justify increasingly strict enforcement, but it was all about generating business for her companies. The case file grew to include financial records showing the flow of money between HOA accounts and Margaret's shell companies. Emails discussing the coordination of violation notices with company formations. Witness statements from contractors who'd been forced out of the neighborhood. Documentation of selective enforcement based on which residents questioned her methods. Evidence of retribution against those who tried to use non-approved service providers. Tom provided valuable historical context. "It started small," he explained during one of our evidence-gathering sessions. "First, she just suggested certain contractors. Then it became mandatory. Anyone who questioned it found themselves buried in violation notices until they either complied or moved. The security cameras caught Margaret making multiple passes by my house during this period, but her behavior had changed. Instead of the obvious surveillance of before, she now drove by quickly, almost furtively. She seemed to be assessing something, planning something, but her usual boldness was gone. "She knows we're building a case," Michael observed when I reported these drive-bys. "But someone who's run a scheme this complex for this long doesn't just give up. Stay alert." The evidence compilation process revealed another disturbing pattern. Margaret had been systematically targeting specific residents for enforcement. Those who showed any independence or questioned her authority found themselves subject to increasingly severe violations. while those who quietly complied were left relatively alone. It was never about community standards, Derek concluded, sharing his analysis. It was about control and profit. The more someone resisted, the more violations they received, and the more work their property required from her companies. Spent hours organizing and cross-referencing all the documentation, my military training in intelligence analysis proving invaluable. Each piece of evidence was catalogued, verified, and backed up in multiple secure locations. If Margaret was planning some final move, we would be ready. The turning point came when we discovered records of similar schemes in her previous neighborhoods. Derek's investigation revealed a pattern. Take control of an HOA, establish a network of service companies, profit from enforcement, then move on just before questions started being asked. Pine Grove Estates wasn't her first target, Michael explained, sharing the findings. It was just her most ambitious operation. She'd refined her methods through practice. As we assembled the final case file, the full scope of Margaret's operation became clear. This wasn't just about harassing one non-compliant homeowner, it was about exposing a years-long fraud that had affected an entire community. The evidence we'd gathered would ensure that this time she couldn't just move on to another neighborhood and start over. That night, reviewing the security footage of Margaret's latest drive-by, I made a final entry in my evidence log. Subject continues surveillance, but shows signs of increasing anxiety. Pattern suggests preparation for significant action. All evidence secured and backed up, ready for whatever comes next. The final showdown wasn't the confrontation I'd expected. Instead of another dramatic HOA meeting or public meltdown, it came in the form of a coordinated legal and regulatory response to our evidence. On a quiet Tuesday morning, multiple agencies descended on Pine Grove Estates, armed with warrants and our meticulously compiled documentation. I watched from my front porch as unmarked vehicles pulled up outside Margaret's house. FBI agents, state financial investigators, and local law enforcement moved with practiced efficiency. The sight reminded me of similar operations I'd participated in during my military service. The same coordinated movement, the same quiet professionalism. "Margaret Thompson," one of the agents called out as they approached her door. "Federal agents with a search warrant. We need you to step outside." Through my security cameras, I could see Margaret's face in her upstairs window. For a moment, she stood frozen, watching the agents approach. Then she disappeared from view. Seconds later, the sound of a car engine roaring to life came from her garage, but the authorities had anticipated this. As her Range Rover burst from the garage, it found its path blocked by positioned vehicles. Margaret had finally run out of escape routes, both literally and figuratively. The next few hours were a flurry of activity. Agents carried box after box of documents from her house. Computer equipment, phones, and external hard drives were catalogued and removed. Despite her recent document destruction efforts, there was still plenty of evidence to be found. "We've been building this case for weeks," Michael explained when he arrived on scene. "Your situation was the catalyst that brought everything to light, but this investigation goes way beyond HOA harassment now. We're looking at wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, serious federal charges." Sarah texted updates from down the street. "They're interviewing board members. Gerald Wilson is cooperating fully. Margaret's being taken to the federal building." The neighborhood gathered in small groups, watching as years of Margaret's careful schemes unraveled. Tom made his way over to my porch, leaning on his cane. As he observed the proceedings, "Never thought I'd see the day," he said quietly. 7 years of her iron-fisted rule ended just like that. But it wasn't really just like that. The end had come because of careful documentation, strategic patience, and the willingness to stand ground against intimidation. My military training had taught me the importance of gathering intelligence and building a solid case before taking action. The federal agents were particularly interested in my security footage and documentation. "This is excellent work," the key lead investigator commented, reviewing my files. "Most people don't think to document patterns of behavior this thoroughly. Your military background shows." As Margaret was led to a waiting vehicle, she caught sight of me on my porch. For a moment, our eyes met. The rage and defiance that had characterized her previous confrontations were gone, replaced by something closer to desperation. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it as an agent guided her into the car. The remaining HOA board members, those who hadn't been implicated in Margaret's schemes, called an emergency meeting for that evening. The community center was packed, but the atmosphere was different from previous meetings. Instead of tension and fear, there was a sense of relief, of a community beginning to heal. "The first order of business," the acting board president announced, "is to acknowledge that serious wrongs have been committed, not just against individual homeowners, but against our entire community. It's time to rebuild, this time with transparency and actual community involvement." I stayed quiet during the meeting, letting the community work through its own healing process. My role had been to stand firm against intimidation and help expose the truth. Now it was up to the residents to reclaim their neighborhood. As the meeting wound down, several people approached me to express their gratitude, not just for standing up to Margaret, but for helping expose the larger scheme that had been draining their bank accounts for years. "You did what none of us were brave." "Enough to do," Mr. Chen said, shaking my hand. "You stood your ground when standing alone seemed impossible." I deflected the praise, pointing out that many residents had shown courage once they realized they weren't alone. Sarah's intelligence gathering, Tom's historical knowledge, even Gerald Wilson's eventual cooperation. Everyone had played a part in bringing the truth to light. That evening, as federal agents finished their initial search of Margaret's property, I made one final entry in my case journal. Operation concluded successfully. Subject in custody, evidence secured, community beginning recovery process. Objective achieved. Not just protection of individual property rights, but exposure of systemic corruption. Reminder, sometimes the biggest victories come not from confrontation, but from standing firm until truth prevails. The aftermath of Margaret's arrest brought significant changes to Pine Grove Estates. The initial shock gave way to a period of intense community reflection and reorganization. The HOA, stripped of its tyrannical leadership, began the process of rebuilding itself into what it should have been all along. A true community organization focused on resident welfare rather than control and profit. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of Margaret's scheme came to light. Federal investigators uncovered even more shell companies and hidden accounts than we'd initially found. The total amount she'd extracted from the community through her fraudulent operations exceeded $2 million over her 7-year reign. The poor residents will be entitled to restitution, Michael explained during our follow-up meeting. The federal prosecution is pursuing asset forfeiture, and any recovered funds will be returned to the victims of her scheme. The organizational changes within the HOA were equally dramatic. The remaining board members, those not implicated in Margaret's fraud, worked with the community to completely revise the association's structure. Gone were the arbitrary rules and aggressive enforcement policies. In their place came transparent governance and genuine community involvement. "We're starting fresh," Sarah told me, having been elected to the new board. "Everything's being reviewed, every rule, every policy, every contract. If it doesn't serve the actual community, it goes." My property, of course, remained independent of the HOA, but I found myself increasingly involved in the neighborhood's recovery. My experience in military reorganization proved unexpectedly valuable as the community worked to establish new systems and procedures. "It's like rebuilding after a natural disaster," I explained to Tom during one of our evening chats. "The old structures are gone, but that gives you a chance to build something better." The garden that had initially sparked so much conflict became a symbol of positive change. Other residents, freed from Margaret's restrictive policies, began asking for advice on their own improvement projects. The raised beds I'd designed to accommodate my disability became a model for accessible gardening, inspiring several neighbors to create similar spaces. Mr. Chen, whose quiet strength had emerged during the final confrontation, started a community gardening program. "In my culture," he explained, "working the earth together builds stronger bonds than any written rules." The security cameras that had proved so crucial in documenting Margaret's harassment found a new purpose. Rather than tools of surveillance and control, they became part of a neighborhood watch program, with residents working together to ensure community safety through cooperation rather than coercion. Derek's final report provided closure on several loose ends. Margaret's previous schemes in other neighborhoods were fully exposed, leading to additional charges. Several former HOA boards reached out to learn how we'd uncovered the fraud, hoping to prevent similar situations in their communities. "Your case is becoming a template," Michael informed me. "Other neighborhoods are using it to audit their own HOAs, looking for signs of similar abuse." The criminal proceedings against Margaret moved forward steadily. Given the overwhelming evidence and several cooperating witnesses, including Gerald Wilson, she eventually accepted a plea deal. The terms included significant prison time, full restitution to the community, and a lifetime ban from serving in any HOA leadership position. But perhaps the most significant victory wasn't the legal outcome. It was the transformation of the community itself. The fear and suspicion that had characterized life under Margaret's regime gave way to genuine neighborliness. People began talking to each other again, sharing resources, helping with projects. Sarah's kids now regularly stopped by to learn about gardening. Tom's expertise in local plants found an appreciative audience. Mr. Chen's community garden became a gathering place where residents could work together and build real connections. "You know what the real difference is?" Tom observed one evening, watching neighbors chat across driveways. "People aren't afraid anymore. They're not looking over their shoulders, wondering if they're violating some arbitrary rule. The property values that Margaret had claimed to protect actually increased after her departure. It turned out that buyers preferred a friendly, cooperative community to one ruled by fear and control. Several new families moved in, attracted by the neighborhood's renewed spirit of inclusivity and support. My role in all this gradually shifted. From catalyst to participant, the military precision that had helped me document and expose Margaret's schemes now helped me contribute to building something positive. My garden expanded to include a teaching area where I could share accessible gardening techniques with other disabled veterans. "Sometimes," I told a group of visiting HOA leaders who wanted to learn from our experience, "the strongest community isn't built through rules and enforcement, but through respect and cooperation." Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that my military training had prepared me for more than just documenting harassment or standing ground against intimidation. It had taught me the importance of community, of standing up for what's right, and of helping others rebuild after conflict. As I made the final entry in my journal, watching the sunset over my now flourishing garden, I reflected on how a simple property dispute had led to such profound changes. "Mission accomplished," I wrote, "but the real victory isn't in defeating an opponent. It's in helping a community find its strength." The story's conclusion wasn't marked by a single dramatic moment, but rather by a series of positive changes that rippled through Pine Grove estates. While Margaret's criminal case worked its way through the federal court system, the neighborhood continued its transformation from a controlled environment to a genuine community. My own property, once the flashpoint of conflict, became something of a model for what could be achieved without oppressive oversight. The raised garden beds, designed for accessibility, inspired similar projects throughout the neighborhood. Veterans groups began visiting, learning how to create their own therapeutic gardens. "It's not just about growing plants," I explained to a group of disabled vets touring my yard. "It's about creating a space that works for you, that helps you heal and grow." The irony wasn't lost on me. What Margaret had tried to prevent as unauthorized modifications was now helping others rebuild their lives. Sarah's children became regular visitors, eager to learn about gardening and listen to carefully edited military stories. Their curiosity and enthusiasm reminded me why I'd fought so hard for this space in the first place. It wasn't just about property rights. It was about creating something meaningful. Tom, my faithful ally throughout the conflict, finally felt free to expand his own garden. "You know," he said one evening, leaning on the fence that had once been a boundary in Margaret's surveillance campaign, "I've lived here 20 years, but this is the first time it's really felt like home." The legal aftermath brought its own, a form of closure. Margaret's plea deal included full restitution to the community, though the process of unwinding her financial schemes proved complex. Her network of shell companies had tentacles reaching into nearly every aspect of neighborhood operations. The forensic accountants are still finding new connections, Michael updated me during our final official meeting. But the important thing is that the system she built can't be replicated. Your stand didn't just expose one corrupt HOA president, it created a blueprint for preventing similar abuse. Derek's final investigation report revealed that Margaret's scheme had been even more extensive than we'd initially discovered. She had been preparing to expand her operation to other neighborhoods, using Pine Grove Estates as a model for how to take control of communities through HOA manipulation. "Your resistance didn't just save this neighborhood," Derek told me. "It prevented her from doing the same thing to others. Sometimes the biggest victories are the ones that prevent future battles." The new HOA leadership, learning from past mistakes, established transparent processes and genuine community involvement. Regular meetings became forums for constructive discussion rather than platforms for control. Property standards were maintained through cooperation and support rather than threats and fines. Mr. Chen's community garden flourished, becoming a gathering place where residents could work together and build real connections. "In my country," he often said, "we believe that growing things together grows understanding." The wisdom of his words was evident in the friendships that bloomed alongside the plants. The surveillance equipment that had once been tools of intimidation found new, positive uses. My security system became part of a neighborhood watch program based on mutual support rather than suspicion. Other residents installed similar systems, but now they were used to protect rather than police. As for Margaret herself, occasional updates filtered through official channels. Her federal prison sentence would ensure she had plenty of time to reflect on her actions. The lifetime ban from HOA leadership meant she could never again use community organizations as tools for personal profit. But the real story wasn't about her punishment. It was about the community's healing. New families moved in, attracted by the genuine warmth and support they found. Property values, which Margaret had claimed to protect through her rigid control, actually increased as the neighborhood's reputation for inclusivity and cooperation grew. My military experience had taught me that true victory isn't just about defeating an opponent, it's about building something better in the aftermath. Watching children play freely in front yards that had once been subjected to militant inspection, seeing neighbors chat casually without fear of violation notices, I knew we'd achieved that kind of victory. The final entry in my journal wasn't about conflict or resistance. Instead, I wrote about the community gathering we'd held in my backyard, where veterans learned about therapeutic gardening while neighbors shared food and stories. The best security, I noted, comes not from rules and enforcement, but from people caring for each other. Looking out over my garden, now mature and thriving, I reflected on how a simple stand for property rights had led to such profound changes. The raised beds that had once been labeled unauthorized modifications were now helping others heal. The independence I'd fought for had become a source of inspiration rather than conflict. The story wasn't really over, of course. Communities, like gardens, require constant care and attention to thrive. But the foundations we'd built, transparency, cooperation, genuine support, would ensure that no future Margaret could turn neighbors against each other for personal gain. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't in defeating a Karen who'd lost her mind over control. It was in helping a community find its heart. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.